Welcome to Messy Liberation, the podcast that dives deep into feminism, business, and personal growth. I'm Becky Mollenkamp.
And I'm Taina Brown. Get ready for another messy conversation through the eyes of two intersectional feminist coaches.
Let's get messy.
Good morning.
Good morning. I think I'm actually in the same time zone as you.
You
today.
are. You're in the central time zone, which is where I am. So you're traveling?
I am traveling. I am in Houston. I'm meeting with one of my clients in person, and then I'm also doing some leadership development, a workshop for her core team of like directors. So that'll be fun. It'll be different from the normal log on to Zoom kind of experience, I think.
Well, that's exciting. Travel is always like nice and exhausting, so I hope it's mostly good. But well, speaking of exhausting, we were going to talk about a very heavy, tiring kind of issue, something that I think for me anyway, and maybe you as well, it sounds like, helped us have an unsettled night of sleep because as we're recording this, which by the time it comes out on Monday will be almost a week old, but not quite. But yesterday in the state where I am, which is Missouri, the state murdered Marcellus Williams via death penalty, via lethal injection for a crime that he very, very likely did not commit. And for a crime that the prosecutors who actually prosecuted him wanted him to not be put to death. Wow. That his defense did not want him to be put to death. The family of the victim of the crime that he likely did not commit did not want him put to death. No one wanted him put to death.
Except for the state.
Except for the state. That, I don't know. There's, maybe it's because, hey, if we say he was wrongfully convicted, we have to pay him a lot of money. That's the thing. A conspiracy theorist and or maybe just a realist might say that could be part of it. Also, we really hate getting things wrong. And then also, I live in a very red state where we have started to learn, we have long known that the right of America is bloodthirsty. They love a good lynching. I mean, and let's, to be clear, Marcellus Williams was a black man, a Muslim black man at that. And, I've seen many people calling this a lynching, and I think that's valid. So anyway, I was very sad yesterday. I took a moment of silence at 6 p.m. when, it was happening and we knew it was happening. All day, people were doing everything. Well, not just all day. It's been weeks of people trying to stop things. Of course, that was probably never going to happen.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's heavy and sad.
It is. I don't know much about the case just because the past few weeks have been a bit chaotic for me personally, but I have seen it pop up on my social media feeds. And just want to say real quick, if you're listening and you don't know anything about this case or you haven't seen it pop up on your social media feeds, you need to train your algorithm a little bit better. Because I think if this is news to you, one, welcome. I'm glad that you're here and you're listening to this and you're listening to us discuss this for you today. But also, this is the kind of information that when you are on a journey of messy liberation, this is the kind of information that should be, quote unquote, coming across your desk on the regular. And it's heavy and it's not something that we like to think about. We don't like to think about death. We don't like to think about how finite our lives are or what happens after we're gone, right? We like to think of ourselves as invincible. So this may be a topic of conversation that not a lot of people are comfortable with, but it's one, death is a part of life. You can't have life without death. So it's important to just acknowledge that and understand that you can't avoid talking about death, whether it's a personal death or a death like this that means so much to so many different communities. But also this is also part of the messiness. Sometimes the messiness is fun when we're talking about problematic faves, and sometimes the messiness is incredibly heavy emotionally when we're talking about state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies. And the American narrative loves a villain that's Muslim, right? Because for so long, the Muslim community has kind of been vilified as like the enemy of like Western or European Christianity. And that goes all the way back to the Crusades, right? Where you had the Roman Catholic Church, like in engaging in these quote unquote crusades to convert, people like the Moors, etc., that practice Islam. And so yeah, I was in the midst of traveling yesterday at 6 p.m. So I didn't even realize that it had passed, that the time had passed for his state-sanctioned murder. I think that's really the only way to call it, or the only thing to call it, when it's a situation where clearly so many people who were involved in the legal process. This isn't just activists and organizers, right? These are people that were involved in the legal process of his case, that were advocating for him to not be executed. So,
well, and I think it's also important to just say that this represents, it's not just the Marcellus Williams case, although that case is like the one that just happened. But 4 days before that, there was also Freddie Khalil Owens in South Carolina. That was very much a similar case where someone admitted to lying on the stand.
Wow.
Days before he was to be executed. And there is like, in both of these cases, no one was saying free this person based on what we've learned. In all of it, it was, can we push pause? Can we just have a little more time to reflect before we take a human life, to say, are we right? Are we getting this right? And the pushback on trying to say, no, I'm not willing to even do that, is baffling. And it's baffling to those of us who think a certain way, but also not surprising at all, because this is deeply embedded in the roots, as you're saying, in the roots of the American system, the way we value and devalue lives. Because it should come as no surprise that most of the people who have been executed this year are non-white, right? Mostly Black. But, because you can look, so just so people know, I want to give a resource here, 2 resources. One is the Innocence Project, a place that people should learn about, give money to. It is trying to change the death penalty in America, because they look at how many people are being wrongfully convicted in so many ways of crimes, but most specifically around how can we be executing innocent people? And it happens a lot. So look at that place. But then there's also something called deathpenaltyinfo.org, where you can go in and look who's been executed by year. It tells you in what states, it tells you what race, it tells you, what method they use to inject to end the life. And a good portion of these people, based on proportions of population, there are far more Black folks being executed than are represented in their portion of the population, if that makes sense. So disproportionately affecting the Black population. And it is really, really upsetting. And also, I just want to make sure that people know that since, 1973, 200 former death row prisoners have been exonerated of all of their charges, meaning that people who would have been put to death, 200 people we found were innocent. That's a really high number, given and that it was wrong that many times, which tells us so much about, when we are doing it, how often we're getting it wrong.
Yeah. That should be a clear indication to people who operate within the system that, hey, let's rethink this. Let's figure out what's going on here, right? Like, if you are a researcher and you're collecting data, right? If you're doing research on genetics and you have a discrepancy that's that big, your entire research will be called into question, right? Like, you wouldn't be taken seriously, and you tried to publish it and say that it was like oh no, this is legit. Like, I'm doing everything right. Like, this thing over here, it's just, oh, let's just ignore it. You know, like, you would be laughed out of the research community. You would be laughed out of the genetic community. Nobody would take you seriously. You would be ostracized. You wouldn't be able to find a job. You wouldn't be able to ever get published again unless you went through, like, first of all, academia is just rough. So they would put you through the polls, right, before anyone would consider hiring you or publishing your research again. But then we have something like this where the discrepancy is so large, and it's like, oh, it's fine, business as usual. And when we use words like the prison industrial system, systemic or structural racism, like, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that, like, so many people who are incarcerated are not white, right? And if you look at just that statistic, you could be like, oh, well, that just means that most of the people who commit crimes are not white. But then when you look at that compared to the percentage of the population that are not white, you see that there is a heavily disproportionate number of not white people who are incarcerated versus white people, right? And so you can't just look at one statistic of data and be like, oh, that's the story. Like, the whole point of data is to compare it to other sources of data, to other types of data, in order to contextualize the data, to build a narrative, to build a story. And so, and I'm like saying data a lot because my wife is a data scientist, but so we have these conversations all the time. But yeah, when we're talking about systemic racism, that's what we mean. We mean that there's a disproportionate amount of non-white people who, one, are incarcerated in this country, and two, are on death row for either offenses that shouldn't. First of all, no offense should require death row. I am heavily against the death penalty. At no point should a legal system, a state, be determining whether or not someone's life is valuable enough to keep or to disregard. And that is the fact that we live in a country here in the US where the death penalty is even a thing, is a direct correlation to settler colonialism, war, imperialism, right? When you go to war, you are forced to contend with other people as less than human. That makes it okay for you to kill them, right? Like, because how else could you look at someone in the face and take their life, right? Unless you're, obviously there are sociopaths and psychopaths and things like that. We know that. But for the most part, when we're talking about one person taking another person's life, you have to, one, detach from a certain part of your own humanity, and you have to divorce that other person from their humanity, right? At that point, they're the enemy, they're an obstacle, they're an object to be disposed of. And when you live in a society that glamorizes and romanticizes and puts war on this pedestal that the US does, right? Where else would we be than to let a system decide whether or not someone could be executed for a crime, however heavy or not that crime is, right? It's a direct correlation to that, because basically the philosophy behind both of those things is the same, is that you are an obstacle to the society that we are trying to create, so we need to dispose of you. And
it's another form of eugenics.
Exactly. Yeah. It's another form of eugenics. And speaking of eugenics, right? Like, eugenics was big in the US at the turn of the 20th century. And I think when people think of eugenics, right, a lot of times they think of Nazism. And most people don't know that Nazism was created and founded off of the principles of US eugenics.
Yep. Hitler sent his people to the US to learn from our scientists about how to do what he saw what we had done with slavery and said, how
can we do that over here?
You guys were really masterful in being able to do these things, and like, let's learn from you. And we don't want to confront that as a society. It feels so much better to look at this other culture, this other group of people, this piece of history, and be able to other it and say, not me, no way. In the same way that so many white feminists now, or white women, I will particularly speak to as one, like to do the othering of, I'm not one of those people, right? I'm not one of the bad ones. I'm one of the good ones, right?
Yeah.
And we do that. And no wonder we do that, because it's indoctrinated into us as Americans. We as Americans, like as a collective, our history has been presented in a way of white saviorism, right? Of our heroics and ending a war without confronting any of the pieces of the role that we had to play in that and how our history affected that. So I love that you're bringing that up. I think it's so important. And I'm going to share an article in, it's really actually not an article. It's more of a study, a scholarly study, but I still want to share it. So I'll put it in the link note, or the show notes, a link to it, because it talks about how capital punishment is very much born out of slavery. Slavery being predictive of executions today, and the state level legacy, that like institutional systemic legacy of slavery, how that still bears out now in capital punishment, and also talking about how racialized capital punishment is. I mentioned it, but this study shares that about how if you're convicted of murdering a white person, you're far more likely to receive the death penalty than if you were convicted of killing a black person. And the same if you are black versus white. And this, like I said, the stats really bear that out, looking at, again, Marcellus Williams is a great example of that, because he was a black man found guilty of killing a white woman. Worst thing you can do, Emmett Till, right? And so that makes so much sense when we look at a lot of these statistics. And the other thing I just want to point out, just sort of like statistically and talking about it, is if we look at the executions so far this year in the U.S., all but one, there was one in Utah. Otherwise, all are in southern states. Most are in Texas, where you are right now visiting, and in Missouri, where I live. Those two states, along with Florida and Oklahoma,
have the highest.
So those
executions.
4 states have the highest execution rates. All southern states, Alabama, Georgia, are also ones that tend to execute. But I think it's also very important to notice where this punishment is used most often, and to clearly show that legacy of slavery, right?
Yeah.
There's just, for people who want to try to divorce that for themselves, are the same kinds of people who allow themselves to fall into some of those beliefs I think you're talking about, of like divorcing the U.S. from anything bad that could have happened in the Holocaust, right? Like, no, only we were there to end that, to be the saviors, not that we had any, like, in no way could we have been a part of modeling that, what happened. And I think if you're trying to convince yourself that the death penalty is somehow now because, it's been so long since slavery, right?
Which, by the way,
it is
issue.
Exactly. No, I mean, like you said, data bears it out. The data is very clear. And this is very much about that.
Like, don't gaslight yourself, right? Like, our legal systems, our politicians gaslight us as a community, as a people, as citizens enough. Like, don't internalize that and gaslight yourself into thinking that this is a separate issue from issues from years ago, right? Because it's the logical conclusion of that legacy of slavery and eugenics and genocide of Indigenous and First Nations people and settler imperialism, right? Not just here in the U.S., but the way that we go to war or help fund wars, in other places. Like, we have this fascination with war, but we create this barrier, like you said, between us as the good people and what other people are doing overseas. It's this concept of like American exceptionalism, right? Like, we are the exception to everything because our manifest destiny was to be on this land and to have this wonderful democratic nation. We're the harbinger of peace, and we're the harbinger of the democratic process, and we're the harbinger of all things that are good and ethical and morally right. And that's just not the case. Like, once you actually start really looking at what's happening here as opposed to just buying into that patriotic bullshit, right? And I will say, I'm not mad that I live in this country. Right now, I wish I didn't live in this country. Like, I wish I lived somewhere else. But like, I'm not unpatriotic. Like, and I think this is where sometimes the conversation gets muddied because it's like, oh, well, you hate America, you're unpatriotic. No, like, I love this country. I love the people of this country. I want this place to be the kind of place that it says that it is. It's just not there. It's just not there. And when you tell me that it's there, but I see with my own eyes that it's not there, that's how I know you're gaslighting me. That's how I know you're manipulating me. And that's where my frustration and my discontent comes in. And this is where things like the civil rights movement, the anti-death penalty, the abolish the death penalty movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the LGBTQT plus community movement, like every community that has been a victim of this American exceptionalism and this manifest destiny, like, has been brought about because of that gap between what this country says it is and what it actually lives out day to day. It's a huge disconnect between the values of this country and how things are actually implemented. And, you know, for both of us who are very much about values alignment, like, this is why we're so frustrated about processes like this.
And why I continue to be so frustrated in this election with people who are talking about voting like this is your last election and like your life matters and like, you know, it's life or death. And yes, and that mostly is coming from either white people or people of color who maybe have not done as much deep like unpacking of some of these issues.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I get that from white people. And they will come at me and say, how dare you like even critique Harris during an election cycle when it could end up getting Trump elected. And that would be the worst possible thing for my trans child or for my daughter and her reproductive freedoms, right? All of these different things. And I think when you say those things, you are being so incredibly tone deaf without knowing it. Obviously, you're not realizing that for
you're
Black
telling
people,
on yourself.
Right. For Black people in America, every election has been life and death and no election has made a difference. And guess what? Democrats continue to get elected and none of it changes. They wake up,
none of it changes.
Right? The day this morning, they're waking up in a world that's no different than yesterday, where they are no less afraid that their Black, brother, husband, uncle, whatever is going to be, murdered by the police on the street, or if lucky enough to survive that, then found wrongfully convicted of a crime and put to death for something he didn't do. That is a reality, right? So yes, now white people, maybe because you have somebody LGBTQ in your life that you love. I'm queer. I get it. Because you have a woman in your life whose reproductive health is, threatened. I'm a woman. I get it. But to say that those things now suddenly make this election or the election of 4 years ago or the election of 8 years ago somehow different or more existential, like a bigger existential crisis, really what are you saying to the Black people in the world around you? Like, it didn't matter until it affected me.
Yeah, exactly. You're telling on yourself. You're telling on the fact that you didn't care when Bush was elected. You didn't care when Reagan was in office, right? You care now because it affects you personally. And not that you shouldn't care because it affects you personally, right? Like, this is where the nuance is. Yes, you should care about this today if it does affect you personally. Obviously, the stakes are higher for you, but to then turn around, like you said, and say, well, how dare you criticize, or how dare you this, or you have no idea, like, the indigenous and the Black people of this country, like, what you have just done is tell them that you have never cared about their rights until now. You have never cared about their livelihood until now. You have never cared about the fact that they have been wrongfully incarcerated, or incarcerated at 3 times the rate, or 2 times the rate, or 4 times the rate, or whatever the case may be, that their people have been almost completely wiped off the face of this land, right? When we think about reservations and how that whole system works, like, it's so unjust, right? It's like, oh, we're going to completely blow up your way of life and then give you this little patch of land where you can operate on, right? Like, Where's the justice there? Where was your outrage then? Right?
Yeah.
One, welcome to the fight. But two, don't kid yourself into thinking that the fight just started.
Yeah.
Like, it's been going on for generations.
Right. Or that Biden, Harris, any of these mainstream Democrats, which are really very centrist people.
Yeah.
Okay. Very. And have gotten more and exceedingly centrist over the years. Don't kid yourself into believing they represent major change. Before I say why, I also just want to, because I just looked really quickly. The statistics are that the National Registry of Exoneration said that 3,200 defendants who were convicted of crimes in the U.S. and later exonerated because they were innocent, which again, that is a lot of people wrongfully convicted. 53% of them were Black. That is 4 times their rate of the population. So 13% of the population is Black. 53% of the wrongful convictions were of Black folks. That has to tell you something. Okay?
Yeah.
About how off this is. But also just to speak about Democrats really quickly, this year is the first year, and I had just found this article today because someone shared it with me as I've been talking more about this issue with Marcellus Williams, that this is the first year that the Democrats have been basically completely silent about capital punishment. They have done almost nothing to voice their opposition. The only mention of capital punishment at the DNC, the convention this year, were the exonerated 5 coming. Kamala has said, I think, nothing. As far as anyone knows, as far as I have seen, at least I think this article's a week old, she has said nothing about capital punishment. I have seen her say nothing about Marcellus Williams or Khalil, who was executed 4 days ago. Nothing about these things. In 2020, Joe Biden pledged that if he was elected president, he would stop federal executions, propose legislation to abolish the death penalty at the federal level, and provide incentives for states to follow suit. That hasn't happened. Okay. Yeah. So when people tell me this is a matter of life and death, and I have to vote for the Democrat because they represent such a marked difference from what Republicans would do, I say, where? There are some issues where they have made some meaningful change, meaningful progress, and some issues where they have had bits of progress, right? But on so many issues that don't seem to affect white people, so maybe they don't care as much, the change has been. What is the difference?
Yeah.
Talk? Sure. But talk means very little if you don't actually
do anything.
Any change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of people of color and Black people are fed up, right, with the Democratic Party as a whole. Like, that doesn't mean we want Trump to win. That doesn't mean we're going to vote for Trump, right? What that means is that we understand that both parties are fucking liars, right? Like, the Democrats have been playing this game of a carrot on a stick. They're like, oh, well, if you vote for us, we'll ratify abortion. If you vote for us, we'll abolish the death penalty. If you vote for us, we'll cancel student loans. If you vote for us, we will, make college education free. If you vote for us, we'll fix healthcare. And then they get in office and they don't do shit, right? They may make a few statements. They might have a few meetings, but they don't do it. They don't do the thing that they say they're going to do, because they know that when the next election cycle comes through, they can guarantee their vote by making the same promises.
They can just bully you back into it. They bully. Right. I mean, honestly, it's very much this bullying of like, shut up and vote blue. It's life or death. How dare you? The alternative is, look what you're going to do. You're going to end democracy. You're going to lead to the death of all of these people. They're going to be rounded up and all these things.
Yeah.
But nothing changes. And they're like, and always it's like you just said this, like, we'll talk about that later. We got to get through the election. Then we'll talk about that meaningful change. And it doesn't happen. And I would say that in some ways, I think it's worse than the fact that they're both liars. I think the Republicans are done lying. They're
they told us who they are.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, because someone said to me, well, but one party has put it down in writing and the other party at least isn't doing that. And I'm like, yeah, but in some ways I respect that more. They're at least being flat out about what they do. Democrats tell you one thing to your face and then do the opposite. Because guess what? They are both in the pockets of corporate interests. And ultimately, that's all that's going to matter.
Absolutely.
And we know that the prison industrial complex is one area of a lot of money. We've talked about it before with the war machine and the private interests that now are involved in wars and why those corporations are making sure that Democrats are still funding wars. The same thing is happening in prisons. If you look to see how now privatized our prison system is, it is baffling and disgusting. And some of the things that are happening inside of the jails in America, and most particularly go read about some of the things that are happening inside of youth detention centers, because they are run, and women's detention centers around maternal health for the elderly and aged as they need health care for sick and chronically ill and disabled populations in prison. It is disgusting and inhumane and terrifying. And so much of that is because we have privatized, and it has become about how can I operate the system in the most efficient way to make the most profits. Basically, the profits come from, I can get more money from the government, right? And then I can scrimp and save, and all that money goes into our pockets as CEOs. So what happens is, we don't care if you need health care. You're not going to get the medication you need. You're not going to get proper, maternal health. You're not going to get the medicine
proper
you
meals.
need. Right. Exactly. You're not going to see sunshine. You're not going to we just will lock the door and throw it away. And how do we get away with it? Because we make humans into animals. Which goes back to a lot of what you were saying in the beginning. And then people will say, but they're not really human, so it's fine. Except how many people are in jail who didn't do the thing they were convicted of? Forget that. I also am with you. I am absolutely against the death penalty. I think prison should not mean inhumane. I think all of it, whether you are guilty or not. But just think about how many people are in there who are not guilty. And there, for the grace of God, go you. Right? It could happen to any of us, most especially if you have less privilege. It's very unlikely to happen to me. Very unlikely, slightly more likely, but also unlikely to happen to my son, right? Men, obviously, it happens to at a higher rate than women. So white women, again, here we are with a lot of privilege where we act as if we have so little. I know I actually probably have the most privilege in this conversation as a white woman. I'm the least likely to be wrongfully convicted, to be wrongfully imprisoned, any of that, to be wrongfully executed.
Because our country has to protect white femininity.
Correct, right? Because women are fragile.
Because women are fragile.
Only
they're
white
innocent,
women, though, are fragile.
They're flowers. Only white women.
Black women are strong, so it's very different, right?
Which Black women are frogs, or hypersexualized, or animals, or ghetto.
Yes.
And I come into this conversation for transparency's sake, having a close family member who was wrongfully incarcerated in Florida. So, one, I studied this in school. Two, I personally lived part of this experience. So I know what the fuck I'm talking about. Like, having to put money in my family member's account just so they can buy soap, a toothbrush, toothpaste, socks, shoes, clothes, things that should be given to them, right? Like, that's how we strip the dignity and the humanity from people. It's not just wrongful incarcerations. It's not just lack of sunlight, but it's also like just basic care.
Enforced labor.
Basic care. Enforced labor.
Basically slavery, because the rates that they are paid are, it's like $1 a day, $2 a day, whatever. It's the most ridiculous. It's basically none. So it's slavery.
Yeah. Let's not even talk about the paid work. Prisoners work in the prison. They are the operations of the prison. They work in the kitchen. They work in the laundry. They do the cleaning. They do all of that for free. That's part of their quote unquote rehabilitation. That is another way that these private prisons, which are all over the country, that is another way that they save money by not hiring a kitchen staff and making the prisoners do it, by not hiring laundry people or cleaning people or maintenance people and having the prisoners do it. That's one way that they save money, and that money goes into their pockets, right? So when we're talking about prison labor, we're talking about the prison industrial complex, like, it is a real thing. It is an absolutely real thing. And if you don't know anything about it, there are two resources I highly recommend. One is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, I believe is her name. And the second is the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay on Netflix. 13th and that New Jim Crow will show you, like, clearly visually lay out the trajectory for you in terms of timeline between slavery and the prisons that we operate today. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unsee it. If you have any empathy for other people, your world will be rocked.
And it's time for us to start to shake off the narrative that we've been given. We have to start to look at the reality of what's happening. I know you have to go, and the last thing I want to mention is you just talked about rehabilitation. which does not happen in
No.
our prison system.
No,
People
the
want to
recidivism
believe
rate
that
is
it's
crazy.
43%. 43% of people who are released from a state prison will be rearrested within a year. So if basically half of the people are getting out and recommitting crimes, we know that rehabilitation doesn't happen. And if it is happening, it isn't working. And what it also tells us is that we're returning people without money, without having learned anything, now with a record where they can't get jobs, into a world that is already discriminatory against them. What do we expect for so many people? What we are doing is just creating a system. It's the, what do they call that? The school to prison cycle.
School to prison pipeline,
pipeline. And then we just consider, like, there becomes a point where someone has the best option is actually to go back to jail. And that is a scary world in which we live. And that is because of racism, point blank. And these issues are heavy and important. And Marcellus Williams, may your death not be in vain. I hope that at minimum, it opens the eyes of at least some of the white people in the world who need their eyes opened, because this was a name that was being, I feel like it did get a lot more attention than a lot of these cases do, which is unfortunate, but also great. Maybe that's also because I'm here in Missouri. So that may be why I think it's gotten more attention, but I've noticed it a lot on social media from non-Missourians. And so I hope, from what I could tell of Marcellus Williams, who seemed to have come to a lot of peace at the end of this is what's happening. And, you know, his final statement was something like, in all things, Allah, like, it was just like, let it be God. And I hope that something comes out of power. Rest in power. And may your death not have been in vain. May it have been, I mean, it's still in vain. I mean, it's still like, there's no justice here, but I do hope that it opens some eyes and maybe we can start to create some change. And the first thing is that we have to put pressure on our political candidates to make this as important an issue as reproductive freedom, as what's going on in Gaza, as all the other issues that you care about, because maybe it doesn't directly affect you, but that doesn't fucking matter.
Yeah. Pro-life is pro every life. You don't get to pick and choose.
Yeah. So thank you for having this conversation with me. I know it was heavy, but I hope that it gets people thinking. We'll share some resources so people can learn more. And I'm excited to chat again soon with you. We're going to be talking, by the way, very soon about I think when this comes out, it'll be like the day before the VP
debate.
Debate. And we're going to do a
debate.
Taina and I are going to get together the next day and put a episode out just about the debate the next day. So you'll be getting 2 episodes next week, if I'm not mistaken. So get it ready. That'll be fun too. So thank you.
I want to say just one last thing too. As if you're listening and you decide to do some research on the prison industrial complex in America, compare that to prison systems in other countries that are comparative to American society and see how different the spectrum is. And I think that helps to contextualize it as well.
Yeah. And if anything comes up from this issue for you that sparked a new idea, that got you thinking in a different way, or maybe a question pops up for you, please email us so that we can address that. messyliberation@gmail.com. And thank you, everyone. We'll be back in your ear holes in like 3 days talking about the VP debate.
Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
I know people say that all the time. And if you're like me, often you just go on to the next podcast. But truly, taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.